Welcome back to Kindness in Real Life. A poor girl's quiet walk on a Virginia beach turns into a daring rescue of a drowning millionaire's son, igniting a love that defies money and distance. Jane Carter saves Michael Parker from the waves, sparking a romance that faces betrayal, sacrifice, and a secret child. Through kindness and grit, they fight their way back to each other, proving love can conquer any tide. It's raw, real, and full of hope. Smash that like button. We're aiming for 29 likes to keep the kindness flowing. Thank you so much. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a bruise of orange and purple across the Virginia sky. Jane kicked at the damp sand as she wandered the shoreline, her sneakers dangling from one hand, the cool water lapping at her bare toes. The beach was quiet now, the tourists long gone, their laughter replaced by the steady hum of waves and the occasional cry of a gull circling overhead. She loved this time of day, when the world felt like it belonged to her alone. The air carried the sharp tang of salt, mixed with the faint sweetness of seaweed washed ashore. Her faded denim shorts were frayed at the hem, her tank top clinging to her skin from the humid breeze. She'd spent the day scavenging for odd jobs, cleaning boats, hauling nets for fishermen, but her pockets were still light, and her stomach growled in protest. She stopped near the old wooden pier, its pilings weathered and slick with moss, and squinted out at the ocean. Something caught her eye, a ripple, then a splash too deliberate to be a fish. A head bobbed above the water, dark hair plastered against a pale face, arms thrashing wildly. A muffled shout cut through the night. "Help!" Jane's heart jolted, her sneakers dropping to the sand. She didn't think. She ran, her feet pounding the wet shore until she reached the edge of the waves. The figure went under, then resurfaced, coughing, flailing, the tide dragging him farther out. Jane yanked off her tank top, leaving her in a plain sports bra, and waded in. The water hit her thighs, then her waist, cold as a slap, but she'd grown up in these currents, knew their tricks. She dove forward, slicing through the waves, her arms pumping with a rhythm born from years of swimming this stretch of coast. The guy was close now, his movements slowing, panic etched across his face as another wave crashed over him. "Hold on," she yelled, her voice hoarse against the roar of the ocean. He sank again, and her chest tightened. She wasn't losing him, not tonight. She lunged, wrapping an arm around his chest just as he started to slip under. He fought her at first, his limbs jerking in blind instinct, making them both dip beneath the surface. Water flooded her nose, stinging her eyes, but she kicked hard, breaking free. "Stop it," she barked, her tone sharp enough to cut through his haze. "I've got you, just relax." His body stiffened, then went limp, either too exhausted to resist or finally trusting her grip. She hooked her arm under his shoulders, towing him back toward shore. The tide pushed against her, a stubborn wall, but she'd battled worse. Her legs burned, her breath came in gasps, but she kept going, the faint glow of the beach lights guiding her like a beacon. Finally, her feet scraped the sandy bottom. She stumbled into the shallows, dragging him with her, his weight heavy against her side. They collapsed onto the shore, waves licking at their legs. He coughed, spitting up water, his chest heaving as he sucked in air. Jane rolled onto her knees, hands trembling from the effort, and looked at him. His dark hair, stuck to his forehead, his soaked shirt, a fancy button-down, clung to him like a second skin. His eyes, a deep brown, fluttered open, wild with shock but alive. "You're okay," she said, her voice softer now, steadying him as much as herself. "Just breathe." He nodded weakly, still gulping air, his gaze locking onto hers. You saved me," he rasped, his voice rough in the salt water. Jane shrugged, brushing wet sand from her hands. "Couldn't let you drown out there. What were you doing anyway?" He coughed again, sitting up slowly. "Swimming. Got caught in the current. Stupid mistake." His accent was different, smoother, not local. She raised an eyebrow. "Tourist?" He managed a faint smile, shaky but real. "Something like that." The distant wail of sirens broke the moment. Someone must have seen them from the pier and called for help. Jane stood, brushing sand from her knees, and offered him a hand. "Come on, let's get you out of the wet stuff before the medics swarm you." He took it, his grip surprisingly firm, and staggered to his feet. "I'm Michael, by the way," he said, his eyes still on her, like he was trying to memorize her face. "Jane," she replied, simple and direct. The sirens grew louder, red and blue lights flashing down the beach road. She stepped back as paramedics rushed over, their voices overlapping with questions. "Are you hurt? Can you breathe?" And Michael answered in a daze, letting them check him over. Jane lingered near the pier, arms crossed, watching as they draped a blanket around his shoulders. He glanced her way between their prodding, his expression unreadable but intense. She didn't know why she stayed. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at her, like she'd pulled him from more than just the ocean. A medic approached her, asking if she was okay, and she waved them off. "I'm fine. Take care of him." But as they loaded Michael into an ambulance, he turned his head, finding her in the small crowd. "Jane," he called, voice cutting through the noise. "Thank you." She nodded, a quick tilt of her chin, then turned back to the water. The beach was hers again, the waves rolling in like nothing had happened. She grabbed her tank top and sneakers from the sand, slipping them on as the ambulance lights faded into the distance. Her pulse still raced, her skin prickling from the cold and the adrenaline. She didn't know who Michael was, some rich kid on vacation, probably, judging by that shirt, but something about the night stuck with her. The way his hand had gripped hers, the raw gratitude in his eyes. She shook her head, kicking at a shell half buried in the sand. "Crazy tourist," she muttered, heading home along the empty shore. Back at her place, a weather trailer a mile inland, she kicked off her damp shoes and flopped onto the lumpy couch. The single bulb overhead buzzed faintly, casting a dim glow over the chipped paint and mismatched furniture. Her mom's cough echoed from the back room, a reminder of the hospital bills piling up on the kitchen counter. Jane rubbed her face, exhaustion settling into her bones. She'd save a life tonight, and that felt good, better than the odd jobs that barely kept them afloat. But as she closed her eyes, Michael's face lingered in her mind. Those brown eyes, that shaky smile. She didn't know it yet, but that rescue wasn't just a fluke. It was the start of something bigger, something that would crash into her life like the waves she'd fought to bring him back from. The ocean whispered outside, steady and endless, carrying secrets she couldn't hear. Not yet. The morning sun crept over the Virginia horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold and pink. Jane stood barefoot on the beach, the sand cool beneath her toes, a salty breeze tugging at her loose tank top and frayed shorts. She'd come back to the spot where she'd pulled Michael from the waves last night, half expecting to find nothing but the usual driftwood and shells. Instead, there he was, leaning against the pier, hands in the pockets of a clean jacket, his dark hair still a little messy from the ordeal. He hadn't left town like she'd figured tourists would. He'd come looking for her. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms. "Didn't expect to see you back here," she said, her tone light but curious. Michael turned, his brown eyes catching the sunlight, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Couldn't leave without saying a proper thank you," he replied, his voice smoother now, less ragged than it had been soaked in salt water. He stepped closer, pulling a small paper bag from his jacket. Figure coffee and donuts might be a start. Jane raised an eyebrow, but her stomach growled at the thought. She hadn't eaten since yesterday's stale bread. "You didn't have to," she said, taking the bag anyway. She peeked inside, 2 donuts, glazed and simple, and a couple of coffee cups still warm. "Guess you're not totally useless then." He laughed, a low sound that rolled over the waves, and she couldn't help but smirk back. They sat on the sand near the pier, the ocean stretching out endless and calm, a stark contrast to last night's chaos. Jane bit into a donut, the sweetness melting on her tongue, while Michael sipped his coffee, watching her like he was trying to figure her out. "So," he started, "you do that a lot? Dive into the ocean to save strangers?" She shrugged, brushing crumbs from her fingers. "Only when they're dumb enough to swim at night. You're lucky I was around." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the waves. "Yeah, luckier than you know." The air between them shifted, easy but charged, like the static before a storm. He told her he was from California, here with his family for the summer, staying in one of those big houses up the coast with decks that overlook the water. She pictured it. Polished floors, glass walls, nothing like her creaky trailer with its peeling paint and leaky roof. Sounds fancy, she said, keeping her tone neutral. He shrugged. It's just a place. Doesn't feel like home. She didn't press, but the way he said it, like he was tired of it, stuck with her. They talked as the sun climbed higher, the beach slowly waking up with joggers and early fishermen. Jane found herself laughing at his stories. How he'd once capsized a kayak, trying to impress a friend. How he hated the stuffy dinners his dad dragged him to. He asked about her life, and she kept it simple. Odd jobs, the beach, her mom. She didn't mention the bills or the cough that kept her up at night. He didn't need her sob story. But the way he listened, head tilted, eyes steady on hers, made her feel seen in a way she wasn't used to. By noon, the heat was pressing down, the sand warm under their feet. "Walk with me," he asked, standing and offering a hand. She took it, his palm rougher than she'd expected, and they wandered along the shore, the water teasing their ankles. He kicked at a wave, grinning when it splashed her, and she shoved him back, laughing as he stumbled. It was easy, too easy maybe, but she didn't care. For once, the weight of her life felt lighter, like the tide could carry it away. As dusk settled, the sky bruising purple again, they ended up at a quiet stretch of beach near the dunes. The crowd had thinned, leaving just the two of them and the endless whisper of the waves. Michael stopped, turning to her, his jacket slung over one shoulder. "I don't want this day to end," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the wind. Jane met his gaze, her pulse kicking up. "Me neither," she admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the faint cologne on him, mixed with the salt of the sea. "Jane," he said, like her name was something precious, and then his hand was on her cheek, warm and tentative. She didn't pull away. Her breath hitched as he leaned in, his lips brushing hers, soft at first, testing, then deeper when she kissed him back. The world shrank to just them, the sand underfoot, the waves crashing a steady rhythm. Her hands found his chest, fingers curling into his shirt, and he pulled her closer, the kiss turning hungry, desperate, like they'd both been waiting for this all day. They stumbled toward the dunes, hidden by the tall grass, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. His jacket hit the sand, then her tank top, the cool air prickling her skin as his hands traced her back. She tugged at his shirt, buttons popping free, and he laughed against her mouth, a sound that sent heat pooling in her stomach. It wasn't planned, wasn't thought out, just raw, messy need. The sand was rough against her knees, his breath hot on her neck, and for a few fleeting hours, nothing else mattered. No bills, no sickness, no worlds apart. Just the two of them, tangled together under a sky full of stars. When it was over, they lay there, breathless, the waves a distant lullaby. Jane stared up at the night, her head on his chest, his heartbeat steady under her ear. "This doesn't change anything," she murmured, half to him, half to herself. He turned his head, his fingers brushing her hair. "It changes everything," he said, quiet but sure. She didn't argue, couldn't, not with the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing keeping him afloat. They dressed in silence, the air cooler now, the reality of the world creeping back in. He walked her to the edge of the beach road, where the dunes gave way to cracked pavement. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, not a question, but a promise. She nodded, her lips still tingling from his kiss. "Yeah, tomorrow." He watched her go, standing there until she disappeared into the shadows of the pines lining her path home. Back at the trailer, Jane slipped inside, the door creaking loud enough to wake a ghost. Her mom's cough rattled from the bedroom, weaker than yesterday, and guilt twisted in her gut. She'd spent a whole day, night, too, with Michael, lost in something she couldn't name, while the bills sat untouched on the counter. She dropped onto the couch, running a hand through her tangled hair, the taste of him still on her lips. Her life was a mess, her mom's medicine running low, the roof leaking in the corner. But for a few hours, she'd forgotten all. The ocean hummed outside, a reminder of what she'd done, what she'd felt. Michael wasn't just some tourist passing through. He'd crashed into her world like a wave she couldn't outswim. She didn't know where this was going, didn't know if it could go anywhere. But as she closed her eyes, the memory of his touch lingered, warm and reckless, pulling her under all over again. Tomorrow, he'd said, she'd hold him to it. The morning sun blazed over the Virginia coast, turning the ocean into a sheet of shimmering glass. Jane stood at the edge of the beach, her sneakers sinking into the sand, the salty breeze tugging at her loose tank top and shorts. She'd barely slept, the memory of last night. Michael's hands, his breath, the dunes still buzzing under her skin. He'd texted her at dawn, "Meet me by the pier." I got a surprise. She'd rolled her eyes at the message, but showed up anyway, her stomach fluttering with something she didn't want to name. Michael was waiting, leaning against a sleek black car parked where the sand met the road. His dark hair was swept back, his button-down shirt crisp, a stark contrast to the rumpled guy she'd pulled from the waves. He grinned when he saw her, a lopsided smile that made her chest tighten. "Ready?" he asked, opening the passenger door. She crossed her arms, eyeing the car like it might bite. "For what?" He stepped closer, his brown eyes glinting with excitement. "I want you to meet someone. My dad." Jane's smirk faded. "Your dad? What?" He took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Because you're important to me. I want him to know you." She hesitated, the weight of those words sinking in. Her life was a leaky trailer and hospital bills. His was summer houses and private jets. But the way he looked at her, earnest and unguarded, made her nod. "Fine. But if he's a jerk, I'm out." Michael laughed, pulling her toward the car. "Deal." The drive up the coast was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Jane stared out the window, watching the beach give way to manicured lawns and towering homes with iron gates. The air smelled different here, less wild, more like money. Michael's hand rested on the gear shift, brushing hers every so often, and she didn't pull away. They stopped at a sprawling house perched on a cliff, all glass and white stone, the kind of place that screamed wealth. She climbed out, feeling the gravel crunch under her sneakers, and muttered, "You weren't kidding about fancy." He led her inside, through a foyer with a chandelier dripping crystals, into a living room where the ocean sparkled through floor-to-ceiling windows. A man stood by a polished desk, his suit sharp, his hair graying at the temples. William. His presence hit her like a cold wave, stern, controlled, everything Michael wasn't. "Dad," Michael said, his voice bright, "this is Jane. She saved my life." William's eyes flicked to her, taking in her faded clothes, her wind-tousled hair. His lips pressed into a thin line. "The girl from the beach," he said, his tone flat, like she was a problem to solve. Jane squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze. "That's me." Michael jumped in, his hand finding hers. "She's amazing, Dad. I want you to get to know her." William's expression didn't budge. "I see." He gestured to a leather couch. "Sit. Let's talk." Jane sat, the cushions too stiff, Michael beside her, his leg brushing hers like a lifeline. William stayed standing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Michael tells me you're local," he said, his voice clipped. "What do you do?" She shrugged, keeping it simple. "Odd jobs. Whatever pays." His eyes narrowed, and she knew he'd already judged her. Poor, unpolished, not worth his son's time. The conversation spiraled fast. Michael talked about her courage, her laugh, how she'd changed him in days. William listened, his face a mask, then cut in. "Michael, a word." "Alone." Jane stayed, put as they stepped into the hall, their voices muffled through the walls. She caught snippets. "She's not our kind. You're being reckless." And her stomach twisted. When they returned, Michael's jaw was tight, his eyes stormy. "Jane, can you wait outside? I'll be right there." She nodded, stepping onto the deck, the ocean breeze a relief from the stifling room. She leaned against the railing, staring at the waves crashing below, when William appeared beside her. His suit jacket rustled in the wind, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You care about him," he said, not a question. She nodded, wary. Yeah. He turned to her, his voice low, deliberate. Then you'll understand why this can't work. Michael has a future, business, responsibilities. You're a distraction. Jane bristled, but he held up a hand. I know about your mother. She's sick, isn't she? Bills piling up. Her breath caught. How did he know? I have contacts, he said, answering her unspoken question. I can help. Money for her treatment, enough to start over. But you walk away from him. Today. Her hands clenched the railing, the wood biting into her palms. You're buying me off? He didn't flinch. I'm protecting my son. Take it, Jane. You need it more than he needs you. She wanted to scream, to shove the offer back in his face, but her mom's cough echoed in her mind. The medicine they couldn't afford, the eviction notice taped to their door. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. How much? She asked, her voice breaking. He named a figure, enough to save her mom, to breathe again. She nodded numb. Fine. William handed her an envelope, thick with cash, and a slip of paper with a bank transfer code. Leave tonight. No contact. He'll move on. She took it, the weight of it searing her skin, and walked back to the car without looking back. Michael caught up as she reached the door, his face flushed. What happened? What did he say? She forced a smile, brittle and fake. He's right, Michael. This us, it's not real. I've got to go. His brow furrowed, panic flashing in his eyes. Jane, wait. She shook her head, climbing in. Take me home. The ride back was silent, the envelope burning a hole in her pocket. Michael gripped the wheel, glancing at her every few seconds, but she stared out the window, the dunes blurring past. When they reached her trailer, she got out fast, the gravel crunching under her feet. Jane, he called, stepping after her, talk to me. She turned, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. It's over, Michael. Go back to your life. His face crumpled, but she shut the door before he could argue, leaning against it as his car peeled away. Inside, the trailer was dark, her mom's breathing shallow from the bedroom. Jane sank to the floor, the envelope spilling cash across the worn carpet. She pressed her hands to her face, muffling a sob. She'd save him from the ocean, but this was drowning in a different way. The money would fix everything. Her mom's meds, the bills, but it cost her the one thing that felt alive. Michael's laugh, his touch, the night in the dunes. It was gone, traded for a stack of bills she hated herself for taking. She crawled to the couch, curling up as the ocean's hum drifted through the cracked window. He'd hate her now, think she'd used him, and maybe that was better. She didn't know how to tell him the truth, didn't know if she could face the look in his eyes if he knew. The waves kept rolling, relentless, and she let them lull her into a fitful sleep, the cash cold against her skin. Tomorrow, she'd pay the bills. Tonight, she'd grieve what she'd lost. The Virginia autumn rolled in slow and gray, the ocean turning restless under a sky heavy with clouds. Jane stood on the porch of her trailer, the wind whipping at her faded jacket and jeans, her sneakers scuffed from months of pacing this stretch of weathered wood. It had been 3 months since she'd walked away from Michael, the envelope of cash from William, now a lifeline, keeping her mom alive. The hospital bills were paid, the medicine stocked, the eviction notice gone, but the hole in her chest hadn't healed. Every night, she heard the waves crashing, a reminder of the dunes, of him, and it stung like salt in a wound. She leaned against the railing, her hand drifting to her stomach, a new habit she couldn't shake. It started with the nausea, mornings bent over the sink, the smell of coffee turning her inside out. Then the missed days, the quiet panic, the cheap test from the drugstore that confirmed it. 2 pink lines, bold as a promise. She was pregnant. Michael's baby. The realization hit her like a rogue wave, knocking the air from her lungs. She'd sat on the bathroom floor that night, the test clutched in her shaking hands, tears blurring the edges of her vision. She couldn't tell him, wouldn't. Not after taking his father's money, not after breaking his heart to save her own. Her mom's voice called from inside, weak but steady now, thanks to the treatment. Jane, you out there again? Jane wiped her face, stepping back into the trailer's dim light. Yeah, just getting some air. Her mom sat on the couch, a blanket over her lap, her cough quieter these days. "You've been off lately," she said, her eyes sharp despite the illness. Jane forced a smile, grabbing a glass of water to dodge the question. "Just tired. Work's been busy." It wasn't a lie. She'd picked up shifts at the docks, hauling crates, scrubbing decks, anything to keep her mind off him and the life growing inside her. But the beach pulled her back day after day. She'd walk the shore where they'd met, the pier looming like a ghost in the fog. She didn't know why. Maybe hoping the waves would wash away the guilt, or maybe because it was the only place she still felt him. Her decision came one stormy afternoon, rain pelting the sand as she stood under the pier's shadow. She'd keep the baby. Not for him, not for anyone, just for her. A piece of something good, something real, in a life that had always been a scramble to survive. She pressed her hand to her belly, whispering, "You're mine, little one. We'll figure it out." Meanwhile, in California, Michael paced the marble floors of his father's Los Angeles mansion, the city skyline glinting through the windows like a taunt. His dark hair was longer now, curling at the edges, his button-down shirt wrinkled from restless nights. He'd spent months searching for Jane, driving up the Virginia coast, asking fishermen, dockhands, anyone who might have seen her. Nothing. She'd vanished, leaving him with the echo of her last words. "It's over." He didn't believe it. Not the way she'd kissed him, not the way her eyes had flickered before she shut the door. He stopped in front of William's office, the heavy oak door shut tight. His father sat inside, papers spread across the desk, his suit jacket draped over a chair. Michael barged in, his voice sharp. "Where's she, Dad?" William didn't look up, his pen scratching across a contract. "I told you she's gone. Took the money and left." "Smart girl." Michael slammed a hand on the desk, papers fluttering. "You paid her off. What did you say to her?" William met his gaze, cold and unyielding. "I gave her what she needed. You're better off without her." Michael's fist clenched, his chest heaving. "You don't get to decide that. I love her." William leaned back, his tone cutting. "Love doesn't run a company, Michael. She's a liability, poor, desperate. She'd drag you down." Michael stepped closer, his voice low, dangerous. "You don't know her. She saved me, twice, maybe, and you turned her into this." William's jaw tightened, but he didn't budge. "It's done. Focus on the business. Prove you're worth my name." That night, Michael stood on the balcony, the Pacific roaring below, a mirror to the Virginia waves he couldn't forget. He'd searched every corner of that coast, her trailer empty, no trace of her at the docks. His father's words gnawed at him, but they lit a fire too. If William wouldn't help, he'd find her himself, and he'd show him he wasn't just a spoiled heir. He went back inside, pulling files from the desk, diving into Parker Enterprises' mess of deals and numbers. He'd earn his place, take control, and when he found Jane, no one would stop them. Back in Virginia, Jane's belly grew, a quiet swell under her oversized jacket. She'd moved inland, renting a tiny apartment above a bait shop, the smell of fish a constant companion. The docks paid enough to scrape by, and she'd started sewing baby clothes from old fabric scraps, little dresses soft and simple. Her mom helped when she could, her health holding steady, though she'd noticed the change. "You're keeping something from me," she'd said one night, her voice gentle but firm. Jane just hugged her, whispering, "It's good news, Mom. I promise." She didn't say more. Not yet. Michael, meanwhile, threw himself into the company. He showed up at board meetings, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his questions sharp. He caught errors in contracts, renegotiated deals, worked late into the night until the staff whispered his name with respect instead of pity. William watched, silent but attentive, his skepticism thawing as the numbers climbed. One evening, Michael stood in the office, a ledger in hand. "We're up 5%, he said, his tone steady. "I'm not just your son. I'm your partner." William nodded, a rare flicker of approval in his eyes. "Keep going." But Michael's search never stopped. He hired a guy, a quiet ex-cop, to track her down, sending him to Virginia with a photo he'd snapped that day on the beach, her laughing, sand on her cheeks. "Find her," he'd said, his voice breaking. "I don't care what it costs." The guy called weeks later, his voice gruff. "She's moved. Small place inland. Looks like she's alone. Michael's heart leapt, but the next words stopped him cold. She's pregnant. He sank into a chair, the phone slipping in his grip. Pregnant. His baby. He didn't doubt it. Not for a second. He confronted William that night, storming into the office. She's pregnant, Dad. Your money didn't erase that. William's face hardened. She made her choice. Michael leaned in, his voice a growl. You made it for her. I'm going to her try and stop me. William stood, his chair scraping the floor. You walk away, you lose everything. Michael didn't flinch. I'll build it back. With her. He left, the door slamming behind him, his resolve ironclad. Jane, oblivious, sat in her apartment, an ultrasound photo taped to the fridge, a girl the tech had said. She smiled, tracing the blurry shape, whispering, just you and me, kid. The ocean was miles away now, but its pull lingered, a thread tying her to a past she couldn't outrun. Michael was coming. She didn't know it yet, but he was. And when he found her, nothing, not money, not his father, would keep them apart. The Virginia summer sun dipped low, brushing the ocean with streaks of gold and amber. Jane stood near the old pier, her bare feet sinking into the warm sand, the salty breeze teasing her faded tank top and rolled-up jeans. The waves rolled in soft and steady, a rhythm she'd known her whole life. Beside her, Ellie, her 2-year-old daughter, splashed in the shallows, her dark curls bouncing as she clutched a seashell, her laughter bubbling over the water's hum. Jane watched her, a smile tugging at her lips despite the ache that never quite left her chest. Ellie's brown eyes, so much like Michael's, sparkled with mischief, a living reminder of a night she couldn't forget. 2 years had carved a quiet strength into Jane. She'd raised Ellie alone in that tiny apartment above the bait shop, stitching together days with Doc's shifts and her mom's fragile recovery. The money from William Parker had saved them. Medicine, rent, a second-hand stroller. But it was gone now, replaced by her own stubborn grit. She knelt, brushing sand from Ellie's cheeks, her voice soft. Found a good one, huh, kid? Ellie held up the shell, grinning. Pretty. Jane's heart swelled, the weight of their little world grounding her. She didn't come to this beach often, too many ghosts, but today, something had pulled her back, a whisper in the waves she couldn't name. Across the dunes, Michael stepped onto the sand, his boots crunching as he paused, his dark hair tousled from the long drive. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his jaw shadowed with stubble, a man shaped by 2 years of searching and fighting. He'd taken Parker Enterprises by storm, rewriting deals, proving his worth, wresting control from his father's iron grip. But it was hollow without her. He'd scoured Virginia, hired help, chased every lead since learning she was pregnant. His daughter, their daughter, was out there, and he'd never stopped believing he'd find them. He spotted her then, Jane, her hair catching the sun, a little girl in her arms, and his breath snagged, his chest tightening. Ellie's curls, her eyes, they were his, a mirror of that night in the dunes. He moved forward, sand shifting under his boots, his pulse roaring louder than the tide. Jane turned at the sound, her gaze locking on him, and the world froze. Michael, she whispered, barely audible, clutching Ellie tighter. He closed the gap, stopping just short, his brown eyes searching hers. Jane, he said, his voice raw, breaking on her name. I've been looking for you. Her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes. What? He stepped closer, his hands trembling. Because I love you. Because I never stop. Ellie squirmed, and Jane set her down, the little girl toddling toward a wave, oblivious. You shouldn't be here, Jane said, her voice shaky. Your dad. Michael cut in, firm but gentle. He doesn't owe me anymore. I run the company now. I earned it. And I want you, Jane. You and her. He nodded at Ellie, his face softening. She's mine, isn't she? Jane's breath hitched, a tear spilling over. Yeah, her name's Ellie. Michael's lips parted, a shaky smile breaking through. Ellie, he echoed, like it was the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. He knelt as Ellie waddled back, holding out her shell. Pretty, she chirped, and he laughed, a sound that cracked Jane's walls wide open. Yeah, it is, he said, taking it, his eyes flicking to Jane. Just like your mom. Ellie giggled, splashing off again, and Jane sank to her knees, her hands shaking. I took his money, she said, her voice breaking. For my mom. I didn't want to leave you. He crouched beside her, his hand finding hers. I know. I figured it out. He forced you. I hate him for it, but I hate myself more for not fighting harder. She looked away, the ocean blurring through her tears. I thought you'd hate me. He squeezed her hand, his voice steady. Never. I just want us, whatever it takes. She met his gaze, the weight of 2 years lifting just enough to breathe. I missed you, she whispered, and he pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. Every damn day, he murmured back. They sat there, the waves lapping at their feet, Ellie playing nearby. Michael reached out, tentative, and Jane let him pull her into his arms, Ellie tumbling between them. I'm not leaving again, he said, his voice fierce. I'll fix this, with her. Jane nodded, her cheek against his chest, his heartbeat a steady anchor. Slow, she said, soft but sure. We go slow. He smiled, brushing sand from Ellie's curls. Slow's perfect. Back in California, Michael faced his father one last time. The office was quiet, the city lights glinting through the windows. William sat behind his desk, his suit crisp, his face unreadable. I found her, Michael said, standing tall. She's got my daughter, your granddaughter. William's pen stilled, his jaw tightening. And Michael stepped forward, his voice calm but unyielding. I'm bringing them home. You can fight me, cut me out, whatever you want. But I run this company now. I've proven it. They're my family, and I'm not letting you take that away again. William leaned back, studying him, the silence stretching thin. You've changed, he said finally, his tone grudging. More than I thought. Michael didn't flinch. Yeah, she did that. William sighed, a rare crack in his steel facade. Do what you want, but don't expect me to play nice. Michael nodded, turning to leave. I don't. Just don't get in my way. The door clicked shut behind him, a weight lifting as he walked out, free. In Virginia, Jane packed up the apartment, her mom folding Ellie's clothes into a box. He's a good one, her mom said, her voice stronger now. Jane smiled, taping the box shut. Yeah, he is. She glanced at the ultrasound photo on the fridge, a memory of the fight she'd won. Michael was back at the trailer site now, buying a small house nearby. A fresh start, not his father's money, but his own. The beach waited, the pier standing sentinel. And Jane knew they'd build something real there, step by step. The Virginia sun hovered just above the horizon, bathing the beach in a warm wash of gold and coral, the kind of light that made the ocean shimmer like a living thing. Jane stood at the edge of the dunes, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand, the hem of her simple white dress brushing her ankles as the breeze tugged it gently. The dress wasn't fancy. No lace, no frills, just soft cotton she'd picked from a thrift shop, but it felt right, like it belonged to this moment. Her hair hung loose, strands dancing in the wind, catching the last rays of daylight. Ahead, a driftwood arch stood crooked but proud, draped with strings of shells and fairy lights that flickered like stars against the fading sky. The waves rolled in steady and low, their rhythm a heartbeat she'd always known. Michael waited beneath the arch, his linen shirt rolled up at the sleeves, the collar open, his boots long discarded somewhere in the sand. His dark hair was tousled from the salty air, a faint grin tugging at his lips as he shifted his weight, a shell ring clutched in his hand. The one he'd carved himself, a piece of that first beach where she'd saved him. Beside him, Ellie scampered in the surf, her tiny sundress fluttering around her knees, dark curls bouncing as she chased a wave, then ran back, giggling. At 2, she was a whirlwind of joy, her brown eyes, his eyes, sparkling with the same mischief Jane had fallen for years ago. She held a basket of shells, tossing them into the air with abandon, her laughter weaving through the ocean's hum. The beach was alive with a small, mismatched crowd, chairs scattered across the sand, faces Jane knew from the docks mixed with a handful of Michael's old college buddies who'd driven in from out of state. Her mom sat near the front, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her smile wide and steady now that the cough was just a memory. She'd spent the morning braiding wildflowers into Ellie's hair, her hands shaky but sure, whispering to Jane, "You did good, kid." Beside her, William sat stiffly, his usual suit traded for a rare linen jacket, his gray hair catching the breeze. He'd come, not with warmth, but with a grudging nod, after months of watching Michael run Parker Enterprises with a fire he couldn't deny. It wasn't love, but it was peace, and Jane took it as a win. She took a breath, the air thick with salt and the faint sweetness of sunscreen lingering from the day, and started toward Michael. Ellie spotted her first, squealing "Mama!" and darting over, her sandy hands grabbing at Jane's dress. Jane laughed, scooping her up, the little girl's weight a familiar anchor against her hip. "You're a mess, huh?" she said, brushing a curl from Ellie's face. Ellie grinned, holding out a shell. "Pretty." Michael stepped forward, his eyes locked on them, a softness there that made Jane's chest ache. "Yeah," he said, his voice low, "really pretty." He reached out, his fingers brushing Ellie's cheek, then Jane's, and for a moment the crowd faded, just the three of them, the waves, the sand beneath their feet. The officiant, a grizzled fisherman named Tom, who'd known Jane since she was a kid, stepped up, his boots leaving prints in the sand. His voice was rough but warm, cutting through the breeze. "All right, folks, let's keep this short. Waves don't wait for nobody." The crowd chuckled, and he grinned, nodding at Jane and Michael. "You two found each other in a storm, literal one from what I hear. Took some fighting to get here, but love's like that. Wild, messy, worth it. So, Michael, you got something to say?" Michael cleared his throat, his hand finding Jane's, his grip steady despite the tremble in his fingers. "Jane," he started, his voice catching, "you pulled me out of the water, but you saved me from a lot more than that. I was drowning in a life. I didn't want you showed me what mattered. I promised to fight for you, for Ellie, every day, slow, steady, like you wanted." Jane's eyes stung, but she smiled, squeezing his hand. "Michael," she said, her voice soft but clear, "you crashed in my world and turned it upside down. I ran once, but you found me, us. I promised to stay, to build this with you, no matter what the tide brings." Ellie wriggled between them, piping up, "Me too," and the crowd laughed, a warm ripple that rolled over the beach. Tom grinned, scratching his beard. "Good enough for me. Rings?" Michael slipped the shell ring onto Jane's finger, its smooth curve cool against her skin, and she slid a matching one, smaller, rougher, one she'd made, onto his. "You may kiss the bride," Tom said, stepping back with a wink. Michael pulled Jane close, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that tasted of salt and years of waiting. Slow at first, then deep, hungry, like the ocean itself was sealing them together. Ellie clapped her hands, bouncing between their legs, and the crowd erupted, Dockhands whooping, her mom wiping tears, Michael's friends cheering. Jane laughed against his mouth, her fingers tangling in his hair, and he grinned, whispering, "We made it." She nodded, breathless. "Yeah, we did." The sun sank lower, painting the sky in fiery streaks, and the beach turned into a dance floor. Someone strung up a speaker, soft music mingling with the waves. Nothing fancy, just a playlist of old songs Jane loved. Michael spun her in the sand, her dress flaring, her bare feet kicking up grains that caught the light. Ellie darted between them, her giggles a melody of their own, and Michael scooped her up, twirling her until she shrieked with delight. Jane's mom joined in, slower, her shawl slipping as she swayed with Ellie in her arms, whispering, "You're my girls." Jane caught her eye, mouthing, "Love you," and her mom nodded, tears glinting in the dusk. William lingered near the edge, his hands in his pockets, watching as Michael danced with Ellie on his shoulders. Jane caught him staring, and he gave a curt nod, less cold than she'd expected. She walked over, sand clinging to her feet, and stopped beside him. "Thanks for coming," she said, simple and direct. He glanced at her, then at Ellie. "She's got his spirit," he said, his voice gruff. "Yours too." It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack in the wall he'd built. Jane nodded, letting it sit, and turned back to Michael, who wave her over with a grin. They ate on blankets spread across the sand, crab cakes from a local shack, lemonade in mason jars, a cake Jane's mom had baked with Ellie's messy help, smeared with blue frosting. The fairy lights glowed brighter as night fell, the stars blinking awake above the arch. Michael pulled Jane down beside him. Ellie curled in his lap, her eyes drooping as the day caught up with her. "You happy?" he asked, his arm around her shoulders, his voice low against the waves. She leaned into him, her head on his chest, his heartbeat steady under her ear. "Yeah," she said, tracing the shell ring with her thumb. "You." He kissed her forehead, his lips lingering. "More than I thought I could be." The small house they'd bought glowed faintly up the beach, its windows warm with light. A home they'd painted together, nails hammered by their own hands. William stayed late, quieter now, handing Ellie a shell he'd picked up as she yawned in Jane's arms. "Nice night," he muttered, and Jane smiled, taking it as the truce it was. The crowd thinned, the music fading, leaving just the ocean's lullaby. Jane looked at Michael, Ellie asleep against his shoulder, the shell ring glinting on her finger. "We're home," she said, soft and sure. He nodded, his eyes shining in the starlight. "Yeah, home." The waves whispered on, endless and gentle, cradling the family they'd built from sand, storms, and love, a tide that held them close forever. Life can pull you under, money, pride, distance, but love fights back. Jane saved Michael from a sea, then from himself, proving kindness can bridge any gap. It's not about where you start, it's about what you build. Michael defied his father, Jane defied despair, and together they forged a family from sand and grit. Forgiveness isn't easy, but it's worth it. Sometimes the hardest choices lead to the sweetest shores. Hold tight to what matters, even when the current's strong. Their story whispers hope. No matter the storm, love find a way home. If this moves you, share it, because the best tales remind us to keep swimming together.